The book of Daniel and the book of Revelation are two very unique books in the Bible because they have a lot of prophecies. And you probably are aware, prophecy is when God reveals something before it happens, so that when it happens, we can see that it was God that explained it, because there's no other way. No human being could predict with such accuracy the things that are found in prophecy. However, the book of Daniel is kind of an interesting layout. It has things that are obviously prophetic because there are symbols and so on. We'll get into that with chapter 2. But the one we have for tonight is really a story. But the stories are also prophetic. And the focus of the book of Daniel is the short period of time just before Jesus comes. And so this book is very important for us to understand and to practice what is told us in the book of Daniel, because that way we'll be ready when Jesus comes. And if we don't practice these things, it will it could actually keep us from being ready to meet Jesus. So this chapter 1, I want to give you a little background in case not everyone has a full knowledge of the Bible. And so we'll begin with Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, and later he became Abraham, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee. And here's the real key point, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now, there are 2 points in that last phrase. It's a reference to Jesus, to the birth of Jesus when he came to this world, that he would be a descendant of Abraham, and through Jesus, every family on the whole earth would be blessed. But the other point is that the descendants of Abraham were to be a blessing to the world in explaining what God had to say to them. And they were faithful some of the time, and some of the time they were not faithful. And unfortunately, as we come down to the time of Daniel, the descendants of Abraham were not being faithful in giving the world an example of what a Christian really should be like. Now, we don't usually call them Christian in the Old Testament, but they were supposed to be living the same way that Christians do today. And the descendants of Abraham were to be examples of what that's like, and thus become a testimony of what God can do in people's lives. Because really, humans are very weak. If anybody can be good, it's because God is working in their life. So that was the call of Abraham because of the work he was supposed to do. But now we jump down to Daniel's time, or close to it. When Daniel went into Babylon, he was approximately 16 or 17 years old. So I'm not exactly sure when this was said in Jeremiah 27. verses 12 through 14. But if you read the book of Jeremiah, you'll see that Jeremiah was called to tell the people a number of things, but one of them is recorded here. I spake also to Zedekiah, king of Judah, according to all these words, saying, Bring your necks under the yoke of the king of Babylon, and serve him and his people, and live. Why will ye die, thou and thy people? By the sword, by the famine, and by the pestilence, as the Lord has spoken against the nation that will not serve the king of Babylon. Now, I only put one text in, but if you read the book of Jeremiah, you'll see that they had gotten so disobedient that God warned them. He said, Babylon is going to conquer you. And that's the kingdom we're going to be looking at in some of the things that happened in Babylon. If you will surrender to Babylon, then they will let you stay in your land and everything will be not too bad for you. But if you resist Babylon, then you're going to suffer the things here. You're going to die by the sword. You're going to die by famine. You're going to die by pestilence. And that's why the question is raised, why will you die? You know, why would you choose that? Therefore, hearken not unto the words of the prophets that speak unto you, saying, Ye shall not serve the king of Babylon, for they prophesy a lie unto you. So here are some false prophets. And the false prophets are telling what we would call the Jews. You see, there was a division that happened after Solomon was king. One of his descendants made it so hard on the people that he split the kingdom, and 10 tribes decided to go together, and 2 tribes also stayed together. Well, we're talking about the 2 tribes when we read this verse. And so here he is telling them, don't listen to the false prophets. They're telling you, oh, don't worry, God will protect the city. He promised he would protect it. And don't listen to Jeremiah. It got so bad that finally Jeremiah said, okay, let's just wait and see who the true prophet is. Well, we know now the true prophet was Jeremiah, because Babylon did come and it did all the things that God said through him that it would do. So now, with that background, we come to the book of Daniel. And we're going to go verse by verse as much as we can. Some chapters we might have to skip a little to get it in. But in verse 1, it says, In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. So exactly like Jeremiah said, here comes the king of Babylon with his army, and he surrounds the city of Jerusalem. Now, we won't look at all of what led up to this, but this was the first time that he came. Later he came because they were so obstinate. He just came again, and finally he did all the things that Jeremiah said he would do. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. Now, God wouldn't have done that if they hadn't been disobedient. You see, God does protect his people, but when they become disobedient, he cannot protect them. And so that's why the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God. which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. Now, if you've read much in the Old Testament, you realize that Moses was instructed to build a sanctuary. And in that sanctuary, there were various articles of furniture, and they all had meaning and so on. And so it's telling us here in verse 2 that Nebuchadnezzar, when he went there, he actually was able to get inside the city, and he robbed them of some of their most sacred things. And later in the book it tells some of the things that he had. They didn't get the ark though, because some of the priests, when he came, the priests snuck it outside the city and hid it in a cave. And so the ark was spared, but some of the other things were captured. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes. So in other words, they were to capture some of the very intelligent children that belonged to the leadership group of Jerusalem. And they were going to take them, their plan was to make them Babylonians. And they were young, so they thought, well, if we educate them, we can make them think like we do. And so they wanted to get these young people. Verse 4, children in whom was no blemish. So they had to be very handsome, good looking, nothing wrong with them, no broken foot or anything. They had to be someone that they considered worthy to be in the king's employ. But well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning in the tongue of the Chaldeans. So they wanted some very smart young men, ones that had been properly trained up until now. They had a lot of knowledge in all these areas. And then they were going to give them the learning of the Babylonians, as well as teach them the language of the Babylonians. Verse 5, and the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank. So, nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So here we have the period of training, 3 years of training. And when the 3 years were finished, they were going to have an oral exam in front of the king. He was going to ask them all kinds of hard questions and see whether they were good students or not. Now, in order to help them really excel in their studies, he was going to feed them from the royal table. He was going to feed them the same food he ate. He was going to feed them or give them the same wine that he drank, which he thought would be good for you so that you would advance rapidly. And here is where we begin to see that God has a plan. Because God was going to demonstrate to the king of Babylon, you got it wrong. You don't understand what will make people very successful in their school and become very capable people in your kingdom. You think this will do it, but that is not true. And so this brought Daniel to a test. Would Daniel be scared and do what the king wanted him to do? Or would he live up to the knowledge that God had given to the Jews? If he would live up to what God had told the Jews, then he would become a light in Babylon. He would show them the better way to live. Well, you can imagine that was kind of a dangerous step for him to take if he was going to be faithful. But he passed that test. Notice in verse 6, now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So here is 4 young men that are named. I'm sure there were more that were taken, but these 4 really stood up for what they had been taught in the Bible, by the way. That's where they got their light from. Verse 7, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar. Now these names were names that fit with their gods. They didn't serve the God of heaven. So these names would kind of say, we worship the Babylonian gods. Verse 7, Daniel was named Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Now it's interesting, through the book of Daniel, I don't know whether there's any reason or not, but Daniel always goes by Daniel, which is his Jewish name. The other 3 go by their Babylonian names. But Daniel had one too, Belteshazzar, and it does appear once at least in the book of Daniel. Here's the key, verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now the Bible is very plain. If he had eaten the food that the king offered, he would defile himself. It wasn't just ceremonial defilement. You know, the Jews had that too, connected with the temple. But this was not ceremonial defilement. This was unhealthy food. He would have damaged his health if he had eaten that food and if he had been drinking the wine. Now, I've seen people try to defend wine drinking from the Bible, and there are places that are pretty hard to explain, you know, why it says that. But here's one place that's really clear. It's very clear. Daniel was not going to defile himself by drinking wine or by eating the food that the king offered him. And so he purposed in his heart, he said, I'm going to be faithful to what God has told us to do, no matter what happens to me. Now here's where we begin to see the prophecy for the last days. God is looking for people that will be like Daniel in today's world, just before Jesus is coming. You know, no other generation has had more evidence that Jesus' coming is soon than we have. Even this COVID, I think, is a warning that Jesus' coming is soon. And so in this, it is giving us a prophecy that how you eat, what you put into your body, will make a difference as to whether you will be ready for Jesus' coming or not. For Daniel, he could not afford the health destruction that he would have had if he had eaten the king's food. And so he decided, no, I'm going to eat what I know I'm supposed to eat, and we'll trust God with what happens. If I get killed, so be it. But I'm going to eat only what I should eat. Now, he had an asset in verse 7. No, not verse 7. We'll see the asset here shortly, yeah.
Verse 9.
Verse 9. Yeah, verse 9. Thank you. Okay, before we get to verse 9 though, I want to point out what Daniel had studied from the Bible as to what we would call the Eden diet. You know, we can actually say the Bible takes us from Eden to Eden. In other words, the Bible starts with the Garden of Eden, and in the end, it's going to take God's people back to the Garden of Eden. And so, here's the way it was in Eden, Genesis 1:29. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat or food. Obviously it wasn't flesh meat there. Now, if you look carefully at that, there are three categories of food that are spoken about: fruits, grains, and nuts. And so that was actually before the fall. That was their diet. And after the fall, Genesis 3:18, something else was added. Thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In other words, vegetables. So fruits, grains, nuts, and vegetables, that was the diet that they had in the beginning. Even after sin came in, that was their diet. Daniel was familiar with that, and he said, I know that diet's the best one, and so I'm going to stick with that. I'm not going to eat the other things from the king's table. Now here's the asset that he had, verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Here's a good lesson for us. Of course, not everybody that stands up for the right is allowed to live. I mean, we know there are martyrs, people that have died. But if God wants to keep somebody alive, they'll stay alive. And he wanted Daniel to stay alive. So he touched the heart of this man that was in charge of the eunuchs. And the man thought, you know, Daniel's a pretty special person. And therefore, when Daniel made his request, God had already prepared his heart to give it to him. Verse 10. I wanted to point out that there's a principle in the Bible found in 1 Samuel 2:30. Them that honor me, I will honor. And that's God speaking. He said, if you will choose to try to honor my name and live up to the truth that I've given you, then I will honor you. And I will bless you for that. And so here we see that in practice. Verse 10. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. So he said, Daniel, you're asking me to do something pretty dangerous. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. Now he was going to learn something too. You see, he thought the diet of the king would make Daniel and his friends healthy. Just like the king thought that. And so he said, oh, Daniel, if you start looking undernourished and you start looking bad, he'll take my head off for giving you the wrong food. So he was concerned. Well, then God put an idea in Daniel's mind. Then said Daniel, this is verse 11, to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Now, pulse is translated vegetables, but it actually has a broader meaning. Anything planted. So we call this the plant food diet. You know, a tree is a plant. It's a big one, but it's a plant. All kinds of things that was in the diet from Adam and Eve, what they ate, they're all plants. And so Daniel is basically asking, just try it out for 10 days and then look and see what you're going to have to do. Now here's really, a test too, because if God doesn't bless their diet in 10 days, that's not a very long time. Most of the time we try to get people at least to try it for 30 days, but he only had 10 days. And so God blessed, and notice what the outcome was. Verses 13 and onward. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he really put God to the test in a way. He said, I'll do what God said, and in 10 days, Melzar, you can decide whether we have to eat the king's food or whether we can keep eating this food that I'm asking for. Verse 16, thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse. So he...
It's 14 and 15.
I did? Oh, sorry. So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. So, at the end of 10 days, they looked healthier. I don't know that this is the best translation, being fatter. Vegetarians, those that eat plant food, they're often not fatter, but they have a better complexion. And so it has that in there as well. He could see that they were healthier just within 10 days. And so he said, okay, in verse 16, then the rest of the time, you don't have to eat the king's food. I'll keep giving you the vegetables. Then, verse 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now here's another story prophecy for the end of time. Notice where their education came from. Came from God. Now they were enrolled in the University of Babylon, but the Bible doesn't say that they got their learning from the University of Babylon, but it says they got their learning from God. And so, how does that work? Well, first of all, they studied their Bible, because there is a lot more information in the Bible than what most people realize. And there is information for every walk of life that will help us excel and do better than others who don't study their Bible. Also, when a person cares about what God wants them to do, then God also comes close to them and teaches them what they should do. And we're going to look at some of those texts here. And therefore, the major part of their education came from God. And besides that, as we read the book of Daniel, we discovered God gave him dreams and God gave him visions. And that's where the prophetic parts will come in, that he learned that from God. So he had God helping him in his daily studies, and he had God helping him by giving him visions and dreams. Now this is spoken about in the Bible, and if we go back to Proverbs 9 verse 10, it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." In other words, those that believe that God is right in what he says, so that they don't want to go against God, they will begin to be wise. And it makes sense. God is wiser than we are, so if we do what he tells us, we're going to be wise. Not because we would be otherwise, but because we're simply doing what he said. Also, way back in Moses' day, God had given this for them, and I'm sure Daniel was familiar with these passages. Deuteronomy 4, verses 1 and 2. "Now therefore, hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you, for to do them, that ye may live, and go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers giveth you." So Canaan was the land that they were headed for. Canaan is an example of heaven. Heavenly Canaan. And so Moses is giving the instruction that God gave him. And he said, if you will obey the instructions that God gave in the form of statutes and judgments, then you will go into Canaan and you will be there a long time. However, he gave a warning. He said, "Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught from it, that ye may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you." So their warning was, don't add anything. Take it like I gave it to you, and don't take anything away. You must practice it exactly like I gave it to you. Now notice what would be the result if they would do that. Goes on in verses 5 and 6. "Behold, I have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that ye should do so in the land whither ye go to possess it. Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom." Notice that again. This is your wisdom. That's how you are wise, by simply doing what God said. and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. So he said, this is the way to become famous, you might say. And people will say, wow, the Israelites are really smart. We better practice what they're doing because they are really smart. And all they could say is, well, we just did what God said. We're not that smart, but we just simply practice what God said. Going back to Daniel 1, let's look at some more of what happened. Verse 18, now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. So now is the oral exam. 3 years have passed, and they are now going to see if they can pass the test. Now suppose they failed the test. I'm sure that the king would find out they haven't been eating on my table, and that's the reason why they failed the test. But of course they didn't. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. So as he interviewed all of the students, I don't know whether he did it together or how he did it, but after he had interviewed them, he discovered that Daniel and his 3 friends stood above all the rest. Verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them not just a few percent better, but 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. So here's people that graduated long ago, and they had a whole lot of time to learn more after their graduation. And Daniel stood above every single one of them. Imagine the king's mouth dropped open and he said, wow, how did this happen? And somebody said, well, they ate a different diet. And that's one of the reasons why they came out so good. And maybe someone else said, well, their God was their teacher. It wasn't just the teachers in the university, but God was teaching them. And they serve the God of Israel, and they have a Bible, and, you know, they have been following what their Bible said. You know, maybe they didn't tell the king right then, but he did find out sooner or later if he didn't find out then. And then we come to the last verse, verse 21. And Daniel continued even unto the 1st year of King Cyrus. Now, King Cyrus was part of the Medo-Persian Empire. So Daniel lived all the way through the Babylonian time of rule and continued into the Medo-Persian Empire. And so we'll be learning more about that as we go along. But he lived to a very old age. He at least in his mid to late 80s. That's how blessed he was by being faithful to the kind of diet that God had given to his people from the beginning. And although you can find other texts and so on, you know, of other things going on, there's also a text in the Bible that says that God allowed them and even gave them texts telling them they could do certain things, but it wasn't good for them. It was because they wanted it so much that he said, okay, if you really want to do that, you can do it. But when we look for what was God's idea, what is best, it's easy to find in the Bible. And so this chapter now becomes a prophecy of two things for the last days, just before Jesus returns. Number one, people that really want to follow God are going to return to a plant food diet. And as a result, they're going to be able to fully get ready to meet Jesus when he comes. Because their minds will be clear. They'll be able to learn. God will be able to get close to them and bless them. And it's also a prophecy that in the last days there's going to be people that are going to get an education very similar to what Daniel received when he was there in Babylon. And they're going to be taught of God, and they're going to have a similar result to what Daniel had in their preparation. And God will use them, like he used Daniel and his three friends, to acquaint the entire world with the God of heaven and the fact that he was superior. They might have those vessels from the Jewish temple in their, in the house where they worship their God. They might have those there, but through Daniel and his three friends, God demonstrated the God of Israel was superior to their gods. And of course, the God of Israel was Jesus. And so, Jesus is superior to any God that anyone can worship. So, that's chapter 1.